Scott, thank you so much for being here today with us. And to start off, I would just be curious to ask you your own question. Why be happy?
There's a misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding is, a response I will get often is, so happiness is overrated. And I'll say, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that individual happiness in the United States and in a very broad sense in the West is derived from one's own satisfaction, one's own needs, one's own desires in a very broad sense. I mean, we're all human, so it's not as if Japan has invented the wheel, but in Japan, the happiness that I observed in an informal way, as well as reading a whole bunch, was that the individual happiness matters less than the happiness of the group. And I found that to be pretty heavy and really interesting, and it has helped me a lot on a day-to-day basis. And this is not a how-to book. I'm not prescribing. I'm not interested in that way. That's how the publisher pitched it. Fine with me. I didn't really have a choice. But the main thing is that the idea is reframing what it means to be happy. And the example I gave in the book, which I experienced on a personal level, where there were two examples. So one was, I go to the gym, I run 5 kilometers, I'm feeling great. And I'm at a stoplight and there's someone holding a sign saying, I'm sober, I'm homeless, help me. And I don't make the connection, but I feel kind of blue. I feel really something's bothering me. And later on, I thought about it and I thought, oh, it's because that person, the empathic quality that all of us have in varying degrees, made me feel sad. My happiness depended on that person's situation. And the other example, which actually led to the title of the book. So my editor said, listen, go ahead. I want something edgy. Give me an edgy title. So I work in a very poor part of Boston. It's my entire clinical practice is in the Black community of Boston. It's been that way for a whole bunch of years, like 30 some odd years. And that's the case for personal and professional reasons. I grew up in a Black city and so on. So I'm driving over to the office. It's not just a Black community. It's a Black community that has a lot of economic issues. And I pull my car into the lot and I thought, why be happy? You know, this is ridiculous. My own happiness is so completely irrelevant to what's going on around here. And what I thought was all of us might feel some degree of greater satisfaction if we're of use to others. It's kind of a long answer.
Yeah, but it's interesting to me that you're saying that our happiness pretty much is not our own, but it's dependent on each other.
Yeah, I mean, and it sounds simplistic, but it's really not. I mean, there's these psychological studies where they take a person and there's two examples. One example is if you have a day, you go to the amusement park, you can have a great time, or you can go to your elderly aunt who you've really loved your whole life and she can't read anymore. Her eyesight's gone, and you spend the day reading to her, which will produce more happiness. And the happiness of people almost uniformly say, oh, well, reading to my aunt. It's not fun, but it's like what a blessing it is to be of use to someone like that.
So with your insights about writing this book, and we'll also talk more about Ukeiru later, but how has it changed maybe your personal and professional way you're living your life?
I did not expect, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition, like, the Monty Python joke. No, I didn't expect the pandemic, of course. But what happened was the book came out 4 months after the pandemic. On a very personal level, this book helped me enormously. And not so much in terms of happiness, but there were two questions that I asked myself every day, because I had to ask myself the same questions every day, because every day was a new day because I was so stressed out. So the first question was, what does nature expect of me? Mm-hmm. Right? And the other one was, how can I meet those expectations? And what I decided during the pandemic, I have so many friends and colleagues who were genuinely and legitimately miserable and upset. And my goal was not to be miserable and genuinely upset, but to try to find what there existed in that space and adhere to it, conform to it, accept it. I don't accept it like resign myself to it, but make the most use of it. So one thing I did, for example, I just read a ridiculous amount because I didn't go into a store in Boston until I think November 8th. Everything was delivered. So, and all my offices where I provide services were closed. And they allowed us to do virtual diagnostic interviews as of late May. So I had a lot of time. And so I was just reading a lot, and I thought to myself, what can I do to make this time valuable? What will each of us say to our children, our grandchildren, whatever, 5 years from now, and say, what was it like during the pandemic? And if we say, oh, I was miserable, I didn't get anything done, I didn't want to be that person. And that to me felt very Japanese somehow.
So ukeireru, to someone who hasn't read your book, how would you explain it?
This book was vetted by a number of Japanese friends because, as anyone knows who's been to Japan, it doesn't matter how many times one has been there, often one has no idea what's going on. And even if one has the language or some cultural familiarity. So I had a lot of Japanese friends and colleagues read this to tell me where I got it wrong. What did I do wrong? And 3 friends are interpreters in Tokyo. One of them is a pretty well-known translator. She was the editor for, if anyone knows, Ted Bester's book on Tsukiji Market. And she was very involved in his book called Tokyo Neighborhoods. And so all 3 of them read a lot. And I said, well, what does this word mean? They gave me 3 different definitions. So I sort of smushed them together. And one friend, Yumi, said to me, it's like standing in a river and allowing the water to rush around you, but not being swept away by it. Another person said, Yuko said something like, accepting the reality for what it is and not contesting it. There it is, not pretending it's something else. And then another person, trying to remember her name, I can't remember her name. She's in Yamanaka Prefecture, and she said, it's the acceptance that a mother has for a child. And so I smushed them together, and the smushing led to, it's the feeling of acceptance between a mother and a child, and being in a river where you're not swept by the water, and accepting reality for what it is. But I found that smushing really worked. And the confusion, again, the misunderstanding, and it's probably partly my fault, but I think it's also a mentality thing. I'm not saying resign yourself to the situation. I'm saying accept the situation, and then what are you going to do about it? I don't want to generalize, so I'm not going to do that. But in an acceptance situation, why pretend that the marriage is a good one when it's not? It's just not. It's not working out. It's been going on for months or for years. Accept that as a reality. And now what are you going to do about it? Are you going to stay in the marriage? And if so, how are you going to do it? So I find that really useful. And again, it's not unique to Japan. It's kind of what we do as therapists. It's stop pretending, you know.
So resignation is actually a really good keyword, because you wrote about the difference between ukeireru, acceptance, and shikata ga nai, resignation. Do you think that we currently as a society are in a state of resignation? And if so, how do we move from shikata ga nai to ukeireru as a collective?
Well, you know, I'm not that smart where it could be like the whole society thing, but I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. I mean, I'm kind of hoping that one of the things I'm hoping is that this pandemic will lead to meaningful change. I mean, Boston, where I live most of the year, is notoriously not a friendly place. It's just not. It's part of the charm of the city. You know, I know the names of my neighbors' dogs, but I really don't know many of their names. It's just the way it is. But since the pandemic, people have been much nicer, and on a very pleasant day-to-day level. I mean, I was walking through Cambridge Common. I live near Harvard University, and I take my dog there because he won't walk in the neighborhood anymore because he likes the variety. Because of the pandemic, he's bored with the neighborhood. So I put him in the car, I drive him to the park, and during the pandemic, complete strangers are coming over to me going, hey, nice dog. And I'm thinking, all right, what do you want? What's going on here? But there's been a change. Or when I go into a grocery store since I started going in, what are you buying there? That chicken pot pie looks good. Have you had it before? I'm thinking, what's happening here? Mm-hmm. People have been much nicer. And I'm kind of hoping that continues. I'm kind of hoping that the value that we have derived from one another during this pandemic continues. The business of the pots and pans in Italy, and that happened in Boston too, where they were banging pots and pans in front of hospitals to thank the clinical staff. I think that there's a potential for that. There's also a potential for people saying we need somebody in charge to stop this communal sense of things. So there's huge risks, but I don't think the societies are resigned. You know.
So it's moving forward.
I hope so. I don't know. I mean, I really hope so. I mean, I'm trying to be positive about it. It's pretty terrifying period of time that we're living through. You know, it could go either way. Yeah.
Also talking about mental health. So obviously the pandemic has done something with all of us, and the stress levels and just mental health issues have been rising all over the world, and also demand more mental health professionals to meet these demands. And I was wondering whether you saw some sort of cultural differences in how these demands are being met here in Switzerland, in Japan, maybe also back in Boston.
That's a difficult question. Certainly in Japan, psychotropics are not uniformly prescribed to my knowledge, and I don't have any friends there in therapy or counseling. The people I know there, either professionally or personally, tend to take, for lack of a better word, holistic approaches. Let's go for a walk in the forest. Let's go to the onsen together. Let's have a quiet dinner and not really talk a lot. Things like that. I find that to be of enormous value. Switzerland, certainly, there's a lot of psychotherapy and counseling that goes on. The friends I have who have issues don't quite see the talking. I wouldn't generalize, but just in terms of the friends I have, they tend to turn towards the psychotropics rather than the therapy. But I have no idea how uniform that is. In the States, everybody's in therapy. I mean, you know, it's a privatization of public stress. I mean, what's interesting about my entire clinical practice at this moment in time is Black women for some odd reason. And one of the things that happens is a lot of the stress that they're experiencing is situational. So I'm sad and I'm worried because my son is 17 and I don't know how safe he is taking the subway by himself to work. So that's a real sadness and a real worry. And so what I'm trying to do and other clinicians are trying to do is help with the stress, but recognize the source. And again, that goes back to what you were asking about societies changing. So one of the challenges, I think, with psychotherapy and counseling in the States, and again, I don't want to be negative, is that it creates a situation where it's individualistic rather than addressing the systemic and institutional causes. And I think those are going to be more addressed and need to be addressed.
It's funny that you're talking about, well, it's not funny, but that you're talking about the privatization of public stress, because you're mentioning collectivism versus individualism quite often in your book. It's one of the main topics. And as I understood it, at least, it was that the West is more focused on individualism and maybe the East or Japan more on collectivism. But now you're mentioning that the public stress that we all experience is, well, privatized. And I was wondering maybe what we can learn from Japan and vice versa.
I think it's a marriage, because the friends I have in Japan, usually it's around midnight, but they'll start to tell me very personal things about themselves, which they don't, as I understand it, share with their friends and family. And it's a balance. I mean, because there's a lot of value to be attached to what are the individual experiences of stress. Why do I fly off the handle the way my dad did when that's kind of interesting. You fly off the handle the way your dad did. Well, maybe you should think about that a little bit. But on the other hand, it's not one or the other. It's not black or white. So I think we have an enormous amount to learn from one another. Certainly the times I've been with friends in Japan going back 20 years now, at first I was really surprised by something that took place, and this happens a lot. So this friend of mine, Jiro, who is the general manager of a beautiful ryokan in Yamanaka in Ishikawa Prefecture, I think. And I hadn't seen him in like 6 months. So we go to the lounge area and we sit down and he puts a couple of these Japanese whiskeys in front of us. And we just sat there for like 10 minutes. Nobody was talking. And I thought, what's going on here? Have I done something wrong? And then after the 10 minutes, he turned to me and said something like, I'm really pleased that you came back to Yamanaka to see me. And I said, and I would say, there's like a catechism. And I said, well, I'm so pleased that you have me here. And that kind of intimacy, I think, is of great value. And it's not, I don't think it's unique to Japan because we have it here with parents and children. So your child is under 5, the child really isn't talking a lot to let you know her needs. So the parent susses it out. And I think that's of value. There's that Japanese expression, reading the air. Mm-hmm. And that happens a lot in Japan with my friends and so on. I think that's something that we could learn from also, to try to imagine what the other person is thinking or feeling and anticipate it. There's a psychologist that I quoted in the book, maybe a psychiatrist. He described the challenges of working as a psychiatrist in Japan versus the States. And he said, in Japan, when he would be out with a colleague, the colleague would know that he wanted coffee without asking him. Somehow he just knew that he wanted coffee. He said, so he went to a professor's house in the States, in Ann Arbor, I think it was. And the spouse of the professor turned to him and said, what would you like? Would you like coffee, tea, or water? And he said, I felt offended. I felt offended that this person would ask me what I wanted. How come this person didn't know? And then he realized I was just being very non-American there. And he said, for Americans, the choice is really important. And in Japan, it's the opposite in a lot of ways. And it happens to all of us who've been to Japan. I mean, I went to a coffee shop in Kyoto. I don't know these people. First morning I sat down, he brought over the coffee, the cream, and the sugar. And I said, I just drank it black. And then he went away. The next day I came back and the coffee was there black. There was no cream and sugar. And I thought, oh, this is great. I want to come here every morning. He knows me. And it wasn't like he was being servile. I've had the sense that he knew what I want, what I cared about. So I think that the idea of anticipating one another's needs is powerful.
Mm-hmm. Can that also relate to the question, what does nature expect of me? Or would you say that's more of a communication typical to, or not typical, as you said, but something that we can incorporate more to our life?
I think it's similar. It's of a piece. I mean, again, everyone who's been to Japan knows that it's not especially religious, but it's very spiritual. Mm-hmm. And I'm not religious in the least. And I deny being spiritual. Scott, you're really spiritual. I'm not, but yes, you are. So, but it's the way in which people glom onto nature, it happens all the time. I took a friend of mine, he was 21, and the son of my friend Yumi. I took him to an NBA basketball game in Boston. And he was like really quiet. It was a really great game. And everybody, 14,000 people were all screaming. He was just sitting there. And finally, I turned to him in the fourth quarter and I said, listen, Nozomi, want to go? No, don't want to go. And then at the end, on the subway ride home, he would not stop talking. He knew all the plays, and it was just, he was absorbing it. And he was adapting, he was accepting the situation, and he was there, he was present, So I think that in a sense, that's close to what we are supposed to experience in nature.
How can we incorporate nature more in our lives?
So I'm not sure it's nature, but it's definitely nonverbal. So for many, many years, and I don't know if it works for other people, I tend to overthink things. I tend to be very analytical, and I can't, it's a problem, let's say. So I find that to balance that, I do a lot of nonverbal things every day. So I love to cook. My wife hasn't cooked since we've been married. So I cook every night. It's a nonverbal activity. I've worked in 3 restaurants for long periods of time, so I can cook without recipes, although I do use them. It's nonverbal. I'm standing there and I'm cooking. I listen to a lot of instrumental jazz every day. I write a jazz column for a newspaper. I have a dog. My dog does not talk to me. I never want my dog to tell me what he's thinking. But anyway, the idea of nonverbal activities that we can enjoy each day that bring us closer to what we're doing, and just to try to stop overthinking. And jazz is really, for me at least, jazz is like that. I grew up in a household where my father listened to a ton of classical all the time. So, and it soothed him. I read recently a musician said that music is I don't know if it makes any sense, but it made sense to me. Music is the one art form that's non-judgmental. And I know that when I'm listening to music, I'm just feeling I'm feeling good. So I would say nonverbal things, certainly since the pandemic, I got about 5 or 6 plants, and normally I kill plants, but I find that that helped a lot too.
Maybe on ukeireru and loss, that's also one of the topics. So how do how do you tell people to basically deal with it or accept it? That must be
don't
hard.
presume. I never presume. So the most I will ever say to somebody who is, I hear stories of the individuals I work with have recently been incarcerated. Some are homeless. Some, and by say recently incarcerated, a week ago, 10 days ago, after 15 years in state prison, drugs, alcohol, chaos, rape, murder, mayhem. So the most I can do in a situation like that is say, I can only imagine how you feel. That's all I do. I don't say, oh, I know how you feel, or you should accept the way you feel. I just say, I can only imagine. That's it. And I don't get upset. I look, I feel dewy-eyed, but I don't feel it's useful for me to start to burst into tears when I hear the story. The idea is to absorb it. And then the challenge, of course, is that when you leave a situation like that, as anyone who works here clinically, if there's any clinicians here, is to find a way to take care of yourself when you leave. And the way to take care of yourself, for me, is nonverbal activities like cooking, walking the dog, listening to music, going for a run, things that are allow you to tolerate the pain that you've just absorbed.
You said that especially back in Boston, you're working a lot with Black communities where obviously you're not a part of. And then in Japan, you're writing a book about part of the Japanese culture. So I would assume it's quite tricky to do that as an outsider. And I was wondering how you approach working and writing about different cultures.
So the idea is to, at least in the Black community, as I say, I grew up in a Black city. My high school was 70% Black. We had riots, we had National Guard. For a bunch of reasons, my parents stayed there. The phrase that is often used in the community is, educate me about what I need to know. And also, I often will turn to people and say, I know my limitations. I'm not trying to pretend to be somebody who I'm not. I have been accepted as a visitor, as a guest in the Black community. I consult to the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I interview ministers to determine their ability to lead parishes. Sometimes it's helpful maybe to talk to an outsider of the community. I don't know, but I love, it helps a lot to love the two communities that I'm in, and to be complete, and to assume that I'm wrong. I always assume I'm wrong. I always assume with someone that I'm saying the wrong thing. So it's a bonus when I'm right. But I grew up in an immigrant household. My father was a German immigrant to the United States. So you went to other people's homes, and it was a different home that we grew up in. It was, so the sense of being a foreigner is not unfamiliar to me.
Mm-hmm. Something that also made me pause while reading your book was that you were writing about that cultures and individuals are shaped by the limitations of the geography of that place. And you were writing about how Japan is quite a harsh place to live in. If you look at the topography, lots of mountains. And I was wondering, because you live in Brownwald, which is also a mountainous area, whether you see any similarities in how these cultures developed or drifted apart. And
I don't know. That's an interesting question. We haven't had volcanoes, at least not in my time. And the canton just required us to have an earthquake thing, but I don't think we've had an earthquake in a while. When I send pictures of Brownwald to my friends in Japan, they're like, oh man, I want to visit you there, because it's peaceful and quiet. And in that sense, it's similar. It's peaceful and quiet, but it's not, we haven't had, except for avalanches, not a whole lot of natural disasters. We had a beautiful storm 2 nights ago, but it was like being at the movies. It was just so great. I'm not afraid of typhoon. I'm not afraid. I think my friends in Japan who live on the coasts are fearful. Certainly during the pandemic, I think they're up to 35% vaccination, but they're so angry and so upset right now. That my friends there anyway. Mm-hmm. So
we do have. Thank you. We do have an online question. Great discussion. I read the little book of Ikigai recently, which means to be a very similar Japanese philosophy to what Scott is describing with his book, which I will now go out and buy. Could he compare and contrast the ideas of his book and that of the Ikigai thinking?
That's a really interesting question. So there's a fellow in Australia who is this big proponent of Ikigai. And there's another guy in Japan who's a neuroscientist named Ken Moji, who's also a big proponent. So it's kind of been discredited a little bit because the Japanese people I know are not walking around happy every day. It's more of a set of challenges that people try to face and accept and show resilience and strength. So I'm not prescriptive. I don't think that the concept of acceptance can be applied in a paint by the numbers way. I think it's a way of life. And so the part that's similar is that I think, as I understand it, Ikigai relates to some features of Japanese traditions and cultures. But the proponents I know of Ikigai are more convinced that it has a prescriptive value. And I don't think my book has much prescriptive value at all. I really don't. I mean, it's really a book about another culture's psychology and how some of the things that operate there in a functional way we could learn from in the same way that some of the things that we do in the West, Japanese can learn from. I think that certainly Japan could benefit from more individualism, and we can benefit from more awareness of the group. One of the things that comes up in conversations with intimate friends, they're going back again 20 years, is two friends independently. One guy has a food company, the other person was working as an editor. And they both said to me, I really hate what I'm doing. I said, why don't you quit what you're doing and start something new? And well, what if I fail? I go, well, then you can go back to what you were doing. So the idea of asserting yourself outside of the crowd, outside of the norm, is challenging. Or I have friends there who are, we all know they're gay, but they're not out. And so it's like, we would love you no matter what. And they're embarrassed, they're ashamed. It's like the way it was in Western Europe, let's say, or the States many years ago. So those kinds of things. I think we learn from one another. That's all. So I don't think that. So in the sense of Ikigai, this book, there's similarities, but I'm not a prescriptive kind of guy.
On the topic of learning from each other, you already mentioned Kuki-Oyomu or reading the air. Do you have any other Japanese communication tools that you love to also use in your personal life?
Yeah, all the time. Yeah, so I apologize constantly to people. And I've only been doing that since I went to Japan, and people are really surprised by it. And I like doing it a lot. So I'll call up customer service, like for a phone company or internet company. It's like, and I'll say, I'm really sorry to bother you, to take your time. And the person's like, you're not bothering me. And I'm like, well, my internet hasn't been working for 6 hours, and I realize it's really a problem. So I don't mean to stress you out about this. I'm wondering if it's a systemic issue or whether it's something in my home. Things like that are really kind of lovely. Or not, or one of the things that I learned a lot in Japan, outside of forums like this one, when I would go to meet farmers in Japan, friends of mine said, just ask one question. Just ask one question. So I went to visit a tea farmer, and my friends said to him, ask him one question, don't ask him a whole bunch. And I said something like, how long have you been a green tea farmer? And then he answered it, and then wait and listen, pause. Do your children want to be farmers with you? Things like that. So I've learned that's been very helpful. The listening that goes on in Japan is really heavy. I've been to meetings where there's a lot of listening that goes on and not a lot of questions. A friend of mine was one of the financial guys behind Noma, the restaurant in Denmark. And he wanted to arrange for a 12-week stay at Mandarin Oriental in Tokyo. He wanted ANA to pay for these 70 people from the restaurant to fly over, and also domestic travel. So we went to Tokyo, sat down with the ANA people, and they said to him, so Mark, how was your flight over? Where are you staying? Been to Japan before? This went on for about an hour, just a few questions. And then he called me up after and said, what just happened? I don't get it. They didn't bring up the whole thing about ANA and paying for the stuff. And I said, they just want to know where they want to work with you. They want to know what kind of person you are, where they can trust you. And then he got a call like 2 days later and said, yeah, we'll do it. But they didn't ask him a single question about why or what. It was more like, do I want to work with you? I find that fascinating. The relationships I have, I have like 3 or 4 groups. I work with Relais Chateau in Japan. I wrote their guidebook, and a couple of other companies in Ishikawa Prefecture. And these relationships go back 20 years, and there's no contract. And it's just, do I want to work with you? And I'm constantly offending people. I mean, constantly doing something wrong. So, and so that's interesting to me too. And people will tell me, I sat in the wrong part of the car. You're supposed to sit behind the driver or behind the passenger, or you put the chopsticks this side of the plate, not that side. You lifted it, all kinds of things. And as a foreigner, I get a bye because they assume that I have no idea what I'm talking about. But the fact that they're willing to and trusting enough to tell me how I got it wrong is very pleasing to me. So I try not to make the same mistake twice. So it's certainly the most relationship-driven culture I've ever worked in or been in, to be sure. And that's something I learned.
So this active listening, I would say, would you think that's a part of being? You said so. You in your book you wrote, whenever you're in Japan, you're very passive. Would you say that ties into that passiveness, or? Yeah,
I mean, 'cause I'm listening. I'm trying really, really hard to know what it is that's expected of me. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to do the wrong thing. And I often will ask, similar to working in the community that I work with in Boston, is this okay, Takeshi? You're fine. Or no, he would say to me. I would be at meetings where this friend of mine, Takeshi from Niigata, would lean over in my ears, ask him whether his business is doing well in Tokyo. How is your business doing well in Tokyo? Look at his card and say something about the card. We met an egg farmer who owns a beautiful Irish tea shop. It looks like it was he brought over the carpenters from Ireland. He brought over the wood from Ireland. It looks like an Irish tea shop. And he just did this. So he came out, and my friend Jiro introduced me to him. And the guy was wearing a 3-piece suit, really beautifully dressed. And I said, oh, so nice to meet you. And he said to me something like, oh, I'm so happy that you're here. Great that you took time out to visit the tea shop. I said, oh, thank you so much. And Jiro just, tell him his suit looks really nice. You're a beautiful suit. So fine, So those things are really important. And I can see why they're important. And I've tried to inculcate them in outside of Japan too. It matters a lot, apparently.
But would you also say that, so there's this honeymoon effect that people often talk about, especially with expats, with exchange students, with people who come and start a new life in a different culture, and then they're all excited for the first couple of weeks, and then afterwards they run into some walls with cultural differences and they get kind of disheartened. And would you say that these people need to become more passive as well, or what kind of advice would you give them?
I tell friends all the time when they go to Japan to behave themselves and not to assert themselves. So the example I give friends is good thing my wife's on here because she would be so mad at me for trashing Americans. Anyway, there was an American couple at a receptionist desk at a hotel in Tokyo. They had lost his suitcase. It happens. There was a young guy a Japanese guy behind the counter, and he was yelling at this, where's my suitcase? And I thought, you are never going to see your suitcase again. It was so mean. And another way to approach it might have been, and I say to my friends who haven't been there before, go up to the counter, lower your head a little bit and say, I'm really sorry. How are we going to solve this problem? There's a suitcase that's missing. I mean, what can we do to solve it? And include the person in the problem solving, and it's not his fault, obviously, but even if it was his fault, why would you do that? And so that passivity is very helpful. And it's also necessary because there's no way of getting around it. I mean, I was supposed to have a meeting in Niigata, and I said to my friend Takeshi, I want to buy presents for my family at the department store before the meeting. You said you're going to pick me up at 9 o'clock. Why don't we do it at 9:30 or 10 o'clock, whatever, so I can get the stuff. Okay. Next morning, he's sitting in the lobby of the hotel at 9 o'clock. And I said, what are you doing? He said, get in the car. We have the meetings. And I said, but I get in the car. But it made sense because he had a plan. He had a protocol. There was something in place that I had not understood, or he had not explained to me adequately.
Did you also sometimes have situations like these when you got frustrated, especially in the beginning?
No, because I like being passive.
Okay.
I find it very relaxing. And it's one of the things that I find fascinating when I go to Japanese restaurants, this omakase business, or even no omakase business. But the restaurant, all they serve is soba. All they serve is yakitori. And it's great. It's like, just let them do their, just one less thing to think about. One less thing. Why do I need to make decisions? You have to, again, it goes back to the relation. Do I trust this person? And it's not uniform. It doesn't happen all the time. But do I trust this person enough to believe that this chicken is going to be good? So I mean, it takes time. I mean, I don't think the first time it happens, but I put a lot of effort into this, into developing relationships there. I mean, I love being there. I'm not happy there, but I do love being there.
Not happy in the sense of why be happy?
No, I'm not. I'm not happy the way, like in Bruno, I'm high as a kite. I mean, I sit on the balcony. It's like, holy smokes, I can't even believe I'm here. I cannot believe I'm here. It's so beautiful. It's just stunning. And so I'm in Japan. I don't feel that way. But what I feel in Japan is I'm so intrigued. It's like advanced calculus. It's like I have no idea what's going on. Each time I go there and I think, oh, I get it. Then it's like, you don't get anything. And you have to go back to exactly where you were to begin with. And that I find really interesting. It's not just the language or the culture. It's not just, it's just the whole thing. It's spellbinding.
Mm-hmm. Well, you and I definitely have different opinions on advanced calculus, but
what I mean is that I'm terrible at math. What I mean is that it's never boring there. It's never boring there. It's always a challenge to try to figure out what's going on. And just when I think I figured it out, I'm wrong. I'm absolutely wrong.
So it's kind of a learning experience.
Times 1,000. Yeah. Always. And I don't think it's a lot, for me at least, there's not a lot of places I go to that are like that. And to the credit of my friends, they're enormously patient with me. And I find it to be a very didactic culture. People are more than happy to tell me what I got wrong.
I see.
Well, I think it's true, but I think that that's part of the culture too. I mean, that's the whole group mentality. This is not what we do here. We're not doing this right now. We expect you to be doing this, not that.
Would you wish to see that kind of didactic culture a bit more here in the Western parts of the world as well? Or?
Well, I think people would benefit from being more patient here, to be sure. It'd be nice. There's a lot of misunderstanding. The first two words, the first word I learned in Japan was sumimasen. And that it kind of means excuse me, it kind of means I'm sorry, but it means a lot of other different things too in different contexts. And the other word I learned was wakarimasu. I understand. And I think that's really interesting because it would be nice to, it doesn't mean I accept what you're saying, doesn't mean I agree with it. It means I understand where you're coming from. And that would be nice to see more of. I don't have to agree with you, but I definitely understand your vibe and interesting. So now where are we? And I think that would be, I would love to see more of that, sure. I mean, one of the challenges right now is there's such profound, at least in the States, profound division. People are really digging in their heels in terms of what they find acceptable in other groups.
Well, maybe as a sort of a change of topic, but you yourself you haven't worked in Japan as a psychologist or lived over a longer period of time. You've been there like sometimes 3 or 4 times a year, if I understand correct. But how did you come to work with Japanese companies? Because you don't speak Japanese fluently, do you?
No, I do not.
How did that happen?
So on a positive note, a lot of information in Japan is communicated non-verbally. So it just is. And the idea is to catch the vibe. And there's a whole bunch of Japanese words that are also from English, American English, from the occupation, let's say, or for a number of other reasons. So I started going there in 2002, I think. And I was part of a media trip with a French chef named Daniel Boulou. And he invited us to go over, I think, 2 weeks after Lost in Translation had opened. And it became evident to people there that there might be some opportunities for collaboration because they wanted something more than Japanese English. So I started writing websites and I started writing about Japanese culture in a way that Japanese that I met liked. They found that one of the challenges for them to represent themselves with Westerners was that there's an exoticization. Japan was exoticized. The women were fetishized, particularly. And so they found that what I was trying to represent was a less ideal picture, a realistic picture, and that seemed to resonate. It was an honest, psychological, realistic picture. The women are not passive. The culture is not beautiful all the time. It's not a perfect place. There's a lot of problems. And so I would write about those things and balance them with things that were positive. One of the articles that I wrote for the University of California was about the ideology of Japanese cuisine and how Japanese cuisine has really gotten global attention, but also has some right-wing history attached to it. So I would write that, and people were, I don't know if they were pleased with the balance, but they appreciated the honesty. And over the years, as I was saying, through relationships with Relais Chateau, they liked the way I described the ryokans. People will say, well, why would you stay at a ryokan? It's so, the really good ones are incredibly expensive. And so they would say, well, why would you spend all that money what do you do there? And I said, well, you nap, you take hot baths 4 or 5 times a day, and you eat really delicious fresh food. And they say, it's like 1,200 francs a night. It's like, why do you do that? And I would say, well, here's why. And I would write about the ryokan. I'm not, if it's affordable, that's why you do it. If you have a choice between that and a fancy hotel, why would you choose that? So the Japanese that I wrote about appreciated the fact that I seemed to get it. One of the guys who vetted this book, Hiroshi, runs a Japanese publishing company. He wrote a beautiful, beautiful book called Japanese-ness. And he took all these very well-known Japanese phrases and described them and explained them to non-Japanese. And he read this and he said, it was really, really nice. And he said, he's publishing this book in Japan, actually, sometime this year, allegedly. And he said that what he found useful about it was Japanese are often asked when they travel, tell us about your culture. And he said, what your book helps us with is an opportunity to explain who we are to non-Japanese. So they liked that. As I say, I spent a lot of time by myself. So, I mean, so when I spent a lot of time by myself, the idea was to try to create observations that were of some use to Japanese.
Mm-hmm. So writing about different cultures, in different cultures, travel writing, all these are things that a lot of people aspire to do too, especially when they're traveling themselves. Do you have any advice you would give someone who wants to start out writing books about different cultures or traveling in general that you wish you knew when you started out?
So it helps a lot to know something and be passionate about something specifically. I have a friend in New York who runs a jazz dance company, and one of her dancers wants to write a memoir / cookbook about, do you know what burlesque is? Mm-hmm. All right, so he wants to write a thing about burlesque and the food that people backstage enjoy when they're doing burlesque. And she wants to do travel writing. And I said, that's a great niche, let's say. So you can't, in other words, you can't simply say, where are the great castles of France? The idea might be, I have a friend who works in Malaysia and he specializes in halal food. So he will travel all around the world and he finds places where people who are Islamic can have and can enjoy halal food without stressing out. Things like that are useful. Number something that you think that you know a lot about and are very passionate about, so it would help a lot. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I was a writer way before I became a psychologist, but I think that being a psychologist, working and writing in Japan has helped enormously because it's a difficult place to understand, and psychology helps a lot with that, I think. So
will you continue to write about Japan, or?
If they let me back in, I mean, it's really a problem. I mean, it's been closed now. I haven't been back since December 2019. friends we keep emailing and texting one another. When do you think? So now I was thinking this November, which is not going to happen. Now we're thinking maybe April 2022. You know, I mean, I don't know.
It's hard to tell.
It's really unbelievable, frankly.